People always ask when I knew something was wrong. But I didn't. That's the problem. There was no explosion, no argument, no single moment I could point to and say, that's when it started. I didn't realize I was being erased. I adjusted to it, and by the time I noticed what was happening, most of me was already gone. That's the problem. I'm telling this story now because I couldn't have told it then. Back then, I was too close to it, too tired, too busy keeping the peace. My name is Thomas Reed. I'm 71 years old as I record this, retired, widowed, and I didn't think I'd be telling this story alone. If you'd asked me 10 years ago who I was, I would have said this without hesitation. A husband, a father, a man who shows up. That last one mattered to me more than anything. I showed up early. I stayed late. I filled gaps before anyone had to ask. What I didn't understand was that showing up too much teaches people something dangerous, that you can be taken apart quietly. My wife, Margaret, tried to warn me. She was sharper than I was. Always had been. Thomas, she'd say, half smiling, being kind doesn't mean being invisible. I laughed it off every time. I didn't know then how literal that would become. Margaret died 8 years ago. Heart failure. No warning. One night she reminded me to buy milk. The next morning, the house felt wrong in a way I didn't yet have language for. Grief doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in, and once it does, it makes you vulnerable to people who are very good at waiting. 6 months after the funeral, my son Daniel moved back in. He was 34, married, working, technically. His wife Laura was polite, soft-spoken, always thanking me for things. They said it would be temporary. Temporary has a way of stretching when no one sets an end date. Just until we get back on our feet, Daniel said. I didn't ask what back on our feet actually meant. I wanted the house to feel alive again. I wanted noise where the silence had been. So, I believed them. At first, I didn't ask for rent. Then I asked for a little. Then I stopped asking altogether. I told myself this was what fathers did. What I didn't see was how quietly the balance shifted. Bills crept upward. My savings crept downward. And no one ever argued. That should have worried me. Behind the house sat my workshop. That room was the closest thing I had to therapy. I built it myself in my 40s. Poured the concrete, framed the walls, wired every outlet. No shortcuts. No borrowed labor. My father's oak workbench sat in the center. Thick, scarred, solid. He built it in the 1950s. It outlived him. Outlived almost everything. Margaret's sewing table sat near the window. She liked the natural light. We used to work in silence, side by side. Comfortable in the kind of quiet you only earn after decades together. Every tool had a place. Every place had a reason. That room held the version of me that still felt intact. Without it, I didn't know who I'd be. Looking back, I understand now why that room became the target. At the time, I didn't even know I had one. Life settled into something that looked stable on the surface. Daniel and Laura stayed longer. Conversations got shorter. Decisions stopped including me. Everything happened politely. That's how I missed it. Then I got the call about my brother. My younger brother Paul lived in Arizona. He suffered a major stroke one morning while getting the mail. His wife called me from the hospital, crying, saying she didn't know how she'd manage alone. I packed a bag that night. Family shows up. That belief had guided my entire life. I didn't know it would be used against me. I told Daniel and Laura I'd be gone a few weeks. They nodded, told me not to worry, said they'd keep an eye on things. I locked the house. I locked the workshop. I left my life exactly where it was. Hospitals erase time. Days blur together. Nights stretch longer than they should. I slept on a couch. cooked when I could, barely checked my phone. I trusted my home. Why wouldn't I? When I finally drove back, the sun was low in the sky. That soft, golden light that makes everything look forgiving. The house looked the same, the yard looked the same. Then I walked toward the workshop. And I stopped. The lock didn't belong to me. A thick, silver padlock hung from the side door. Brand new, heavy, confident. I stood there longer than I want to admit. Keys in my hand, brain lagging behind my body, like it was waiting for permission to understand. I tried my key anyway. It didn't fit. I walked around to the side window and looked inside. The room was empty. No bench, no pegboard, no tools, no sewing table, just bare walls. That was the moment my body understood, before my mind did. I don't remember walking back to the house. I remember opening the door. Daniel was in the kitchen, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. "Oh," he said, "you're back early." I asked him where my workshop was. He didn't look at me. "Laura can explain," he said. "She's upstairs." I climbed the stairs slowly. The door was open, and what I saw on the other side told me, without words, that my absence hadn't been accidental. What used to be my workshop was no longer mine, and the people who changed it never once planned to ask, because by the time I came back, they'd already decided I didn't need it. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, not because I didn't understand what I was seeing, but because some part of me was still waiting for a reasonable explanation. The walls were painted a pale yellow. Soft padding covered the concrete floor. A white crib sat where my father's workbench had been. Margaret's sewing table was gone. So was every trace that I had ever belonged in that room. Laura stood behind me. One hand rested on her stomach, in that protective way pregnant women have, even when no one is threatening them. "Surprise," she said. Her voice wasn't excited. It was careful. I turned slowly. "Where is my wife's sewing machine?" I asked. "In storage," she said. Too quickly. "It's safe." "And my father's bench?" She hesitated. "In storage too." "And the tools?" "Most of them." She looked at the floor when she said it. "You didn't ask me," I said. "We tried to call," she replied. "You didn't answer." My brother was learning how to swallow again without choking. I looked back into the room, the crib, the rocking chair. The small framed prints already hung on the wall. This hadn't been done in a hurry. Daniel appeared in the doorway like he'd been waiting for his cue. "Dad," he said, "you're upset." I didn't respond. He went on anyway. "We needed the space. The spare room is small, and this one has a bathroom." It just made sense. That word again, sense. As if the decision had made itself. I walked past him and down the stairs. Daniel followed, talking as we went. "You barely used it anymore. You can still do your projects. We thought you'd understand." "When was the last time you even built something?" he asked. 3 weeks ago, I said, "before I left." He paused, then said, "Okay, but still, Arch and 1. It struck me. Why do you want me to call you?" I asked. He didn't answer. I turned around. "Whose name is it under?" I asked. He glanced toward the stairs. "Mine," he said. "Why does that matter?" I didn't need to. That night, I packed a small bag and left. I told myself I needed time to calm down. What I really needed was distance, before I convinced myself this was acceptable. Apparently, the motel room smelled faintly of cleaner and old carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. Margaret used to say grief made you careless. Not reckless, Just tired enough to stop protecting yourself. That night, I finally understood what she meant. Apparently, the next morning, I met my attorney. His name was Charles Whitman. He'd handled Margaret's estate, my retirement, everything important. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set his pen down. "Thomas," he said, "they modified your property without permission and removed your belongings. Legally, they're in the wrong." I nodded. "You want to proceed with eviction?" I hesitated. 30 days, I said. Charles looked at me for a moment. "This is your son," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's why it hurts." When I returned to the house later that day, Daniel was waiting in the living room. Laura sat beside him, eyes red, hands folded, and there was someone else, a man in his late 60s. Gray hair, expensive suit, comfortable in the space. "This is my father," Laura said. "Richard." Richard stood and extended his hand. I didn't take it. "I'm here to help calm things down," he said, smiling. "No need to make this harder than it already is." "You turned my workshop into a nursery," I said. "While I was out of state." He waved it off lightly. "People make improvements," he said. "After 4 years, expectations form." "Expectations," I repeated. "Stability," he said. "Continuity." Then he looked at me more closely. "At your age, change can be difficult." "I want the room restored," I said. "Everything put back." Richard's smile thinned. "That's not realistic," he said. "The baby's coming." "That's not my problem," I replied. His voice lowered. "You should think carefully about how far you want to take this." After they left the room, my phone rang. It was my neighbor. "Thomas," she said, hesitating. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything." She paused. "Laura's been telling people you're having memory problems." I sat down. "She said you get confused," the neighbor continued, "that they moved in to help you." "How long?" I asked. "About a year," she said. "She even started a group chat." I hung up and sat there for a long time. Nothing felt confusing anymore. Clear, actually. They hadn't rushed. They hadn't panicked. They'd prepared. The room wasn't the point. Control was. That evening, I called Charles again. "I need you to add something," I said, "and I want to update my will." He didn't ask why. 3 days later, my brother's bank called. They said they'd noticed some unusual activity, large transfers, made while he was still in the hospital, all sent to an account with a name I recognized immediately. The phone call from the bank was brief, polite, businesslike. "Mr. Reed," the voice said, "we need to verify some transactions on your brother Paul's accounts." I sank into my chair, and then they said the name on the account. "What kind of transactions?" I asked. "Large transfers," the banker replied, "while he was hospitalized, all going to an account registered to Daniel Reed." I felt my chest tighten. Daniel, my son. The numbers weren't small. They weren't mistakes. They weren't even miscalculations. $52,000 in 3 weeks. I couldn't breathe. I called Paul immediately. He didn't know. He hadn't even logged in. Laura had been helping him with his online banking because of his limited mobility. That's how it happened. She had been there. Daniel had been there. I sat back, staring at the floor. The house, the workshop, the crib, the sewing table, the tools. They weren't trying to renovate a room. They were taking control, piece by piece. I called Charles Whitman again. "They have my brother's money," I said. My voice was quieter than I expected. "They've crossed a line," he replied. "This is criminal. Wire fraud, elder financial abuse. We need to involve law enforcement." I nodded, even as my hand shook. 11 days later, A detective arrived. Detective Sarah Martinez. She was efficient, focused, didn't flinch when I explained what had happened. Mr. Reed, we've had reports of unusual transactions on Mr. Paul's account, she said. We need statements, logs, any supporting documents. I handed them over. Every receipt, every note, every date. I think I know who did it, I said quietly. And why? Weeks later, they called me in to identify Daniel in bank records. I looked at his handwriting, his signature, every transaction time-stamped. I could trace him to every location, every withdrawal, every account login. It was deliberate, systematic, calculated. And I realized something that made my stomach twist. I had let this happen, not entirely, but partly, by giving him control, by giving him trust, by thinking being a good father meant being patient. I had enabled it. Court preparation was surreal. I was asked to testify, to speak of my son as a criminal. I thought about Margaret. She would have understood. She would have demanded I protect myself. I hadn't been protecting myself before. I had been preserving a false peace. Now there was no peace. When the trial started, I sat in the courtroom and watched Daniel in an orange jumpsuit. The prosecutor outlined the pattern. He accessed my brother's accounts while he was incapacitated, siphoned funds to cover expenses he never discussed with me. The evidence was overwhelming. The timeline of the money matched his location at every hour. The storage unit, the nursery renovation, the fake concern about my memory. Every lie became a chain that led back to him. Laura was listed as an accessory. Her pregnancy became a mitigating factor, but it didn't erase her role. Daniel sat quietly, no excuses, no emotion. I realized in that moment that the son I thought I knew, the one I had raised, nurtured, excused, was gone. All that remained was this version of him, the one who calculated, manipulated, and betrayed. Sitting there, I thought of every warning I had ignored, the small signs, the way he minimized my time in the workshop, the excuses for why things had to be done now without asking. The way Laura had subtly built the story about my memory, how carefully it had all been constructed. I had been erased, yes, but I had been erased slowly, quietly, practically. After the verdict, Daniel was convicted on all counts. 3 years in state prison. Laura received probation and community service. Their daughter, a little girl I had never met, would grow up without a father. I won't lie, that part hurt, a lot. But what hurt more was the relief I felt, because for the first time in 4 years, I knew my life belonged to me again. I returned home after the sentencing. The house was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but my workshop was waiting. I spent 2 days restoring it, hanging every tool, reassembling my father's bench, returning Margaret's sewing machine to its place near the window. I left the pale yellow paint on the walls for now, a reminder. Neighbors who had been told I was losing my memory looked at me differently. I saw it in their eyes. They no longer doubted me. I no longer doubted myself. Months later, I received a letter from Daniel. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't excuse himself. He explained what he was learning in prison. Therapy, responsibility, the reality of how much he had hurt people who had trusted him. He included a promise to repay the money, slowly, month by month. I folded the letter carefully, put it in my pocket, and for a moment, I wondered if trust could ever be the same again. I didn't reply immediately. I didn't need to. I just walked to my workshop. The tools smelled faintly of sawdust. Margaret's sewing machine gleamed in the sunlight. I picked up the jewelry box I had started for Paul's wife years ago, and I worked on it again. For the first time in years, I felt grounded. Even then, as I felt relief, one thought lingered. This wasn't just a workshop. It wasn't just money. It was my boundaries, my trust, my identity. For 4 years, someone had been systematically testing all three, and now I needed to reclaim more than just my workshop. The first morning after putting Daniel's letter away, I woke to sunlight spilling across the workshop floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the air. I breathed it in, the faint scent of sawdust, old wood, and varnish. It was the smell of a life paused, waiting for me to return. I walked slowly through the house, room by room. The walls were still pale yellow. The crib remained empty. The sewing machine gleamed near the window, like a quiet guardian. And yet, for the first time in years, the house felt alive. Not just a vessel of memory, but a space of possibility. I found myself in the backyard. The garden had gone wild, weeds overtaking the paths. But there were roses I remembered planting with Margaret, their petals stubbornly red. I knelt and touched one, and something tight inside me loosened. The house, the garden, even the workshop, they weren't just spaces. They were markers of my life, of my choices, my boundaries, my identity. I picked up a pruning shear and began clearing the overgrowth. Each snip felt like reclaiming, each branch a small victory. But then I noticed something buried beneath the weeds, a rusted tin box half covered by roots. I set it aside for later, a reminder that some parts of the past linger longer than we expect. Weeks passed. Slowly, the world outside began to notice. Neighbors who had once whispered about my memory lapses now nodded respectfully as I passed. Some asked about my health. Others complimented the restored workshop. I smiled politely but said nothing. No explanation was necessary. I had already explained enough, to myself and to the empty rooms of my house. And yet, despite the calm, I felt a tug I hadn't anticipated. A loneliness, a gap left by the choices of others, by the loss of people I thought I could trust. Daniel, Laura, the daughter I had never held. I decided to write letters. Not to Daniel, he was still serving time, but to Paul, to the few friends who had stood quietly by me. I poured out memories, regrets, hopes. Each letter was a stitch in the fabric of my repaired life. I didn't expect replies. I didn't need them. I needed to reclaim the narrative of my own story. One day a small package arrived. Inside was a photograph of Daniel's daughter. Her small hand clutched in her mother's, a mischievous grin on her face. On the back, a note. She's growing fast. We're learning too. For a long time, I stared at it. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel resentment. I felt something more complicated. Distance, bridged with cautious hope. Maybe trust could be rebuilt, but it would have to be slow, carefully, thoughtfully. The workshop became my sanctuary. Each day I immersed myself in projects I had abandoned, repairing furniture, restoring old tools, finishing the jewelry box for Paul's wife. But this time, it wasn't just work. It was ritual. Every measurement, every cut, every polished surface was an assertion. I am here. I decide. I belong. One morning, I pulled out an old photo album. Images of Margaret smiling, of Paul laughing beside me, of Daniel as a boy tugging at my sleeve. I turned the pages slowly, tracing their faces with my fingers. I allowed myself to remember the love without the betrayal. It didn't erase the past, but it put it in perspective. Then came the unexpected, a knock on the door late in the afternoon. I opened it. A young couple stood there, holding a small, trembling box. "Mr. Reed?" the woman asked. "We found this in a storage unit being auctioned. We thought it belonged to you." Inside was a chest I hadn't seen since Margaret's death. filled with unfinished projects, letters, and photographs. It was a time capsule of life I thought had vanished. I carried it to the workshop, placing it on the workbench. For hours, I sifted through each piece, handling it as if it were fragile glass. Life had not been stolen from me. It had been paused, waiting for me to choose how to continue, not explanations. Stories, small narratives of the past, the lessons, the memories, the joy. Each one was a tether to the world and a guidepost for the future. When I wrote about Margaret, I didn't weep. When I wrote about Paul, I smiled. When I wrote about Daniel, I paused, measured my words, and allowed complexity without bitterness. One evening, as the sun set through the workshop windows, I realized something important. Life was finite, fragile. Loss was inevitable. Betrayal could break bones, but not necessarily hearts that were ready to heal. I understood that boundaries were not walls. They were living markers, flexible but firm, drawn carefully to protect what mattered without isolating myself from connection. And then I saw her, Daniel's daughter, through the window. She waved, a shy, awkward wave, and I waved back. Nothing was rushed, nothing was demanded, but a bridge had begun to form. It was imperfect, tentative, and real. I returned to the workbench. The jewelry box for Paul's wife sat there, half finished. I picked up the tools. Each stroke of the sandpaper, each careful join of wood, became a meditation on trust restored. Trust in myself, trust in others, trust that life could still hold joy even after betrayal. By winter, the house was fully restored. The garden bloomed under careful hands. The workshop hummed with activity and life. Letters had been written, dinners shared, bicycles ridden, photographs framed. My life was not perfect, but it was mine, fully, finally reclaimed. I often thought about the past 4 years. Daniel's betrayal, Laura's complicity, the house slowly taken over. They were chapters I had survived, and more importantly, they were chapters I had learned from. I understood now that family was not always defined by proximity or blood. Sometimes family was the people who stayed, who believed, who returned when they could. And sometimes, family was the memory of love that guided your hands, your decisions, your boundaries. I sat in the workshop, the jewelry box polished and complete, and looked around at the tools, the sunlight, the walls. The room was mine again, fully mine, and yet, I knew life would continue testing boundaries. But now, I had proof I could rise to the challenge. For 4 years, someone had tried to take my identity, my trust, my life. Now I held them all firmly in my hands, and I smiled. If you liked this story, then please like, subscribe, and share this video to never miss out such stories which are left behind.